All right, everyone, I am back. This is again Dr. Christine Coons reviewing human development, genetics, and sex development with humans. I'm grateful to carry on this conversation of or this continuation of intersex. So I guess this would be considered a part 2 of the previous video that I recorded. So during the last presentation, I finished with a slide that represented about 70 to 80 different differences of sexual development or ways to look at intersex. These aren't necessarily conditions per se or syndromes per se. These are just natural things that happen to humans, and we are, as a medical community, are recognizing these things, recognizing patterns and assigning names to them. However, it is very important to recognize these people are individuals and need to be treated as such. So I'm going to go back into the slides and we're going to carry on this conversation about intersex and what that means. So here we go back into the slides. So where I left off the last time was a big, huge list of a lot of named entities that we've used to describe certain patterns of human development. You'll recognize a few of these on here, like Klinefelters and Turners. You may not be familiar with Swire or androgen insensitivity. Some of you may or may not. I described that mine is up there in the third column at the very top is Kalman syndrome. But there's a lot of ways to represent these patterns that we see in medicine. And there might be some of these that you look at and you say, well, I don't recognize that as an intersex entity in itself. Once you dive into the literature with these entities, you will find that the variability is quite high and that variations of sex development are actually represented by some of these names. Now, what's interesting though is when you look at this list, you will find that this list is actually represented by this slide right here. Every single one of those entities will find a place somewhere in the midst of this diagram. And whether you want to fit or pick and choose how they're represented or how they vary from person to person, they are all represented here. So as we go back into that, all these entities can be represented also by some sort of genetic component to it. As I mentioned in the last slide, when we look at the genes that are involved in sex development, there's a number of them. It's not just one, it's not just the SRY gene, it's not just SOX9, it's a collection of a lot of different genes. This is just a list of some of them, just because if I put a whole bunch on here, like over 200, it would just fill the screen and just be overwhelming. As you look at this list though, notice that the chromosomes that they're attached to are not just the X and the Y chromosomes. It's not just the Y, it's not just the X chromosome, it's the collection across the entire genome that makes us who we are, which means that there's an intense amount of variability that is included in this. Consequently, with all this variability, most differences of sexual development remain undiagnosed and unrecognized. We do not always see externally what is happening internally. And this is part of the reason why we do blood work. This is part of the reason why we do imaging studies in medicine, because our physical exam skills aren't enough to be able to represent what's happening internally to the body. So as a consequence of that, differences of sexual development can be diagnosed at birth, puberty, attempts at pregnancy, adulthood, or potentially never. So it is actually better to think of sex as a more complex system or spectrum with variable layers and perspectives than just thinking of it as a binary. Now, a lot of times people will see online that there's this 1.6% of the population has some form of difference of sexual development. This is coming from Anne Faust Sterling in the book Sexing the Body. And if you see a representation number of 0.006, I believe is the number, that is actually coming from a counter argument from a Dr. Leonard Sachs, who says, no, you're misrepresenting what intersex means. It's much less than that. Now, the challenge with that is that the title of Dr. Leonard Sachs' article is very easily found in Google searches. So a lot of people will do a Google search for prevalence of intersex. And because that title is part of his article, it rapidly comes up as one of the first several articles in this discussion. As a consequence of that, people anchor onto this document saying that this is an accurate representation of the number of differences of sexual development. It is not. It is actually probably becoming far more common than we think, and that is actually very appropriate and foundationally, genetically, and developmentally possible on all spectrums. So for example, I put on here a statistic of 11% of married couples are infertile for various reasons. And a common reason for that is a difference of sexual development. Whether we find out that they have Turner's, or whether they have Klinefelter's, or De La Chapelle, or Swyer syndrome, or some other variation that we have not described as of yet. One of the most telling statistics here is that 20 to 40% of all conceptions are aneuploid. Now, again, aneuploid just means a different number of chromosomes than what is expected in humans. The number in humans is 23 pairs, or a total of 46. So somebody who has Klinefelter's is a number of 47. Somebody with Turner's is a number of 45. Turner's in of itself is an extremely common cause of miscarriage, or the representation of missing a Y chromosome or X chromosome is extremely common in miscarriage. And it is also very important to recognize that people who have differences of sexual development can be fertile. It is not uncommon for that to be the case. So how do we treat these individuals? Well, the first thing we do is we actually respect these individuals, that they are expected part of the human population and that they are not mistakes. Due to the wide variability of these individual presentations, there is no one right way to look at this. We have to take each person individually. Decisions for medical treatment should be up to the individual themselves and not based on societal or cultural expectations. And I'm going to emphasize this immensely. We need to stop sex normalizing surgeries at birth. I did, this is an article down here that is talking about just a basic survey of individuals with Klinefelter's, and they asked to represent their birth certificate. What did it say on their birth certificate? And usually we think of Klinefelter's individuals as, well, they have a Y chromosome, therefore they must be male. Well, according to their birth certificate, 92.5% of them were male, 3.75% of them were female, and it is important to recognize that this does not add up to 100%. So whether they didn't include the birth certificate in the survey or not, who's to say? But also wanted to represent what was their identity in the midst of all this. So we're comparing their gender identity compared to their birth certificate and recognizing that there is a variation of how this works. 65% of them identified as male, 6% of them female, 4% non-binary, 2% gender fluid, 3% neither, 1% equal male and female, and 1% intersex. This, again, does not add up to 100%. So again, whether they didn't want to answer that question or not, it was up to them. So now that we have this foundation where we talked about human sex development, the variability of intersex and these differences of sexual development, now we can carry on this conversation about what on earth is gender identity. I personally do not like the current definition of gender identity, which is a person's innate sense of self. I find it way too vague. It's easily disrupted. It could be representative of many different things. But again, this is something that I personally feel that's the current definition. The way I think about it is in terms of relationships. Gender identity is a relationship of inputs and outputs from the body to the inputs and outputs and processing of the brain. It is a relationship of expected and unexpected results from these signals in relation to a person's sex. So our gender identity is housed in the brain. There are different specialized regions of the brain that cater to different functions inside the body. There is an area of the brain that's responsible for gender identity. There's one for sexual orientation. There's one for sexual expression or gender expression. There is a huge list of sections of the brain that are responsible for this. This map comes from a website down below. And I like it because it shows a lot of these complex relationships. This is not a complete map. This is probably needs to be updated at some point. But again, this is what is representing like the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe in these relationships. The ones that we are interested in, where we look at sight, smell, romance, identity, sexual function, expression, are actually in close proximity to each other, which makes a lot of sense. We would expect that gender identity and sexual orientation are related to each other. They're interrelated to each other. They're not the same, but they are related. Because when you look at another person and you say you're romantically attracted to them, you are using your gender identity and contrasting that with another person, and you're building a relationship based off of those building blocks that we have inside our brains. I threw in this slide just because I found this very fascinating. Researchers mapped the neurons of the fruit fly in October of 2024, which is just not too long ago. So the fruit fly the brain has 150,000 neurons, of which there are 50 million connections. The human brain has about 86 billion neurons and about 100 trillion connections. We have a long way to go to fully appreciate and understand the human brain. In this slide, we have actually already studied the areas of the brain that are associated with sexual orientation and gender identity. These are the structures that are involved with that. And most of those structures are part of the limbic system, which is the central part of the brain. So I've represented that here with the hippocampus. The occipital lobe is towards the back. The temporal lobe, all these structures are interrelated, interconnected, and near each other. And that would be expected. So gender identity is absolutely variable. It can be congruent with somebody's sex. It can be incongruent. It can be either, both, or some significant variability of in between. This can be represented in modern terms, whether we use cisgender, transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, or agender. We are using terminology to assign how somebody is representing themselves to society. Now, we need to recognize the brain of itself is a separate entity than the gonadal tissues or the development of the person's sex. And that's represented here in this next slide. The brain does not develop with sex chromosomes. It does not develop masculinization or feminization based off of whether you have an S or Y or not. As a matter of fact, the S or Y gene is minimally functional inside of the brain, such that we can simply ignore it. There's a couple of portions like in the midbrain that actually has some function with the SRY gene. But if you think about brain development, it's exact same between males and females. The question is whether you're going to have an influence of feminization or masculinization. Of course, those terms are rather ambiguous in themselves. This effect is actually entirely dependent on hormones. And when we look at the expression of hormones inside of the brain, or the like androgen receptors and estrogen receptors, it's vastly larger than anything associated with the Y chromosome. These images come from the proteinatlas.org. So as a consequence of hormones leading to masculinization or feminization of the brain, there's an immense amount of variability that exists along that as well. So if you imagine that you have developing gonadal tissue that are starting to produce hormones, those hormones are going to be traveling to the brain and have to be able to enter into the brain to have their effect. So you have to get from point A to point B. Well, that's going to have a lot of variables in between. One, how much a hormone is produced. Is the hormone actually being produced or effectively produced? It also depends on the timing of hormone release. Is it early? Is it late? Is it right on time? There's the rate of hormone release. Is it fast or is it slow? The pattern of hormone release, is it actually stuttering? Is it ramping up? Is it slowing down? And then once it gets into the bloodstream, it has to get to the brain, which can have variable distribution as well. Once it gets to the brain, those hormones cannot cross the blood-brain barrier by themselves. They need receptors. In this case, it's the androgen receptor and the estrogen receptors. So the number of hormone receptors can have an influence on this. The distribution of those hormone receptors, and again, those sensitivity of hormone receptors. We actually have several of these represented in variations of sexual development. For example, androgen insensitivity syndrome would very much apply to the distribution, the number, and sensitivity of those hormone receptors. There has already been research about this. Hines in 2011 discussed the research to that point. Prenatal testosterone exposure, including levels and timing, have an influence on expression, identity, and orientation. The conclusion, there's a lot of variability. Other considerations in 2023 include genetics, epigenetics, hormones, hormone balance, and even immunology. As a consequence of this concept that there's an immense amount of variability, there is no one trans gene. There is no one gay gene, because we have to take all these considerations into the picture, not just one variable. This next slide is basically what I've already talked about. We're taking the gonads, we're going through the bloodstream, and we're getting to the brain. So gender dysphoria is distress and unease related to the relationship of the mind and the body. There is variability in the signaling sent to the brain and what the brain expects. We need to keep in mind that while we try to conceptualize this idea, it is very important to recognize there's a lot of potential causes or sources of gender dysphoria. This is certainly one aspect that would explain this biologically, developmentally, and anatomically and physiology. So again, the treatment of gender dysphoria is to create an environment of welcoming. Most people with gender dysphoria have a lot of fear of how people will perceive them. Care is individualized, and there's some guidelines that are already out there. And of course, I have my references. So thank you for your time. What I'm going to do going forward is try to evolve some of these discussions into deeper presentations, pull out some journal articles, maybe pop into one of these textbooks and see if I can turn this into some slides. Maybe talk a little bit more about chromosomes and how they develop inside the body and how aneuploidy works. Talk about things like chimerism and mosaicism and things of that nature. So thank you for your time. I hope you found these very insightful.